picking sticks with yframework. So in this lesson we won't write code. I already wrote everything. Actually, some of it is code we already wrote for the picking sticks game. I just ported it to my own framework. That's it. So to use my framework you need to include the yengine2d.hec. You'll need to put in update yengine update. You'll need to create my update function and update entity costume. If you remember, my update runs inside yengine update and update yentity runs in the world's update for each entity. I explained how it works in the video about my framework, but basically that's how we update our entities, like if the entity type is player, to the update player. Well, you don't have to check if it's active, but I like to check if it's active too. If it's stick, update stick. Let's go from the start. So yeah, basically that's how you update game objects, and that's how you update worlds. If the world is game, do game update, which is inside game world. We'll go over it. We're just going over code. It's nothing new you haven't seen. Here I load the images, I give them an ID, like I did in all of my videos. That's how I use images. I put their IDs on variables. Also, to make my framework work, you will need to create a world. I created many worlds, though we don't use it. We use only game world, so you need to initialize it, well, declare it, initialize it, and change to game world. So we have two entities, player and stick. We create player using the create player function and create stick. Create stick doesn't get arguments for position, that's 20x, 20y, and speed of 5. Create stick doesn't get anything because its position is random and it doesn't have speed. So y add world, to game world add player and stick. Let's go now. You see we inserted also the player class or player file and the stick file, and the world itself has a file. So I separated everything so it won't clutter our main file. That's how I like to do things. That's how you should. That's what I suggest you to do. So now we're in player.hec. Let's create player. It gets x, y, and speed s. You create p. It's a y entity object. You don't really need to know how yengine works. What's y entity? You don't really need to understand it. You treat it as a black box. You only need to know what y entity does and what methods it has, which you will see in this video and later videos. So let's see. So we create p as an entity and return it. So in main, when you call create player, it will set player to this entity that we create here, and it will add it to the world. And when the world updates, it will call update world and pass that entity. It has a y type of player, as you can see here. When we create the player entity using the new entity function, we also give it a type of player. New entity gets x, y speed and player img, which is, where is it? Stick picker. It's this image. That's its ID 2. And I copy pasted the code for manipulating the sprite map. That's set sprite animation p.id. ID is the sprite's ID. We don't set the sprite ID because yengine2d sets them. Actually, when you call new entity, you see y entity has an ID. it sets it automatically. It has an entity count, sprite count, and it gives it the current sprite count. Like if it's the first entity, it will be 1, the second 2, etc, etc. So set sprite animation for the player entity sprite. Also, new entity creates a sprite. Its dimension is 36 height and 36 width. It has 20 frames. We already covered this in the last lesson. And we set the sprites to 3, same sprite ID from the P entity we created. It holds the sprite ID on .id. Well, if you don't get it, I suggest you watch my previous video about basically we use, like, every sprite has its own ID, and to use it more comfortably, I attach it to the yEntity object. So yEntity object, its ID is representing a sprite, an HEK sprite. So basically it's a sprite with some data attached to it. That's it. And to access the sprite's ID, we just called the entity's ID. P is an entity, you see? P is an yEntity. If this explanation is not enough, please write about it in the comment, in a comment to this video, or contact me via the HEK forums, or my contact form, or any way you can contact me. Oh, and here we return P. Well, if you know HEK, you probably already know this. So update player. We use update player here in update yEntity custom. So if the current entity in the world update loop is a player, it will only be like the only entity that update player will run for is a player entity, and the only entity that will have the player type is an entity created using create player. So yeah, so this E is 100% a player entity, most likely, unless something changes the entity type. Basically, I do not advise changing entity type at any stage of the game, unless it's absolutely necessary. So basically, if the entity type is player, call update player, which is this function. This function. So it takes the entity, the player entity, and passes it to control player and picksticks. Control player, I basically just copy pasted the code without using my framework's code, and it worked fine. We get the sprite's ID for the entity ID. And yeah, we already covered this code in the picking sticks tutorial. But basically, you get the sprite's X and Y position, get the speed of the entity, and if it clicks up, move it by Y and change its frame. And it does the same with a little bit of variations depending on the direction you want to go and the frame of the sprite. Again, I covered this in an earlier tutorial, so that's nothing new. I just copy pasted this code from the earlier picking sticks, the non-yframework picking sticks version. Now pickstick, you see we call pickstick here, that's the second one. It gets the player entity that we get from here. So here I did use my framework's code. We initialize, we declare an entity called T, the target we will collide with, potentially. T equals hit test the player entity with a stick entity, any stick entity. If is entity T, if T is an entity, if hit test returns an entity, it means collision happened. If it returns 0, then no collision happened. and it won't be an entity, like if it's 0. So if we get an entity, do this. Move the target stick to a random position and increment points. That's it. So we have update stick and create stick. Let's go to stick and see that. Update stick does nothing, because the stick does nothing. It only moves to a random position once you collide with it. Create stick is simple. You create an entity. Its XY position and speed doesn't matter. You need to pass it the stick image ID. This, which is 1 in our case. Yeah, change its type to a stick. Move it to a random position and return it. So like we can add it to the world. Like we set stick to a stick entity using create stick and add it to a world. Let's see it. So random pose can work with any entity, even a player entity. It basically gets a random x and y, random from 1 to 300, and sets sprite x, the entity's ID, the entity's sprite ID, which we call ID. We set it to x, and the same with y. That's it. And for the text, we need, well, I basically copy pasted it, this code that initializes the points and rank, and the text, the two text objects, the points and the rank. Set its position and set its text size to 30. Update game, which is called here inside my update only when the current world name is game. We call game update, and game update does update text, which set the text string to, in the case of points text, to points plus the points casted. We cast it to a string. We cast the point to string using str, and the rank is already a string, so we just add it. And if points is bigger than 10, the rank text is stick picker. If it's 20, it's stick pro picker, master stick picker, and the ultimate rank, no life, if you pick more than 40 sticks. Well, the game is the same game. Same game. Picking sticks. But I like this structure. Let's say it's very flexible. Let me demonstrate. Let's copy create stick. Let's duplicate this line. And let's drop it here. So this will create a new stick and add it to world. And now we'll have 2 sticks. It's that modular and dynamic. This is just the tip of the iceberg. We can do many more things, like if I wanted a stick to have an HP, I'll go to s.ynts.insert. Let's say it has 8 HP. So that's its HP. It's at position 0, so when I get a stick and I want its HP, I'll call s.ynts at position 0 like that. Something like that. Without the insert, of course. But to initialize it, yeah, so now our stick entity has an HP attribute, kind of, on its inside. And then I can write, the logic for it in maybe an update stick, maybe in a method that update stick will call. It's very flexible. It's very structured. You might not see the potential, like most of you. I don't think will even reach this point in the video. If you're here, then good luck. Well, no, congratulations. Apparently you really want to make games and really want to use my framework, which is smart. Or you're just watching it to criticize me, that's another option. But anyway, my framework is very flexible. As I mentioned before, it's based on concepts from the Flixel framework and the Flashpunk framework, which I'm a big fan of. I literally ported it to a basic language without object-oriented programming and simulated some level of the modularity OOP gives. So imagine this as a class, a player class. That's the constructor. That's like the update in Flashpunk or Flixel. And yeah, Flashpunk also had the heat test and types. Flixel too, I think. So yeah, there's not much to it. It's the same code, just structured differently. I suggest you take a look at both of them. That's why I made this, for this exact reason. So you'll have something to compare it to, like with my framework, without my framework. This is a very simple project. Well, it's good it's a simple project. That way you can easily compare it. In next tutorials I'll try to make more complex examples and show you how my framework scales to larger projects and how it makes it easier to create complex projects. If you don't need if you don't make a complex project, you can use, like AppGameKit vanilla, but I would suggest using my framework anyway. I don't know, there might be a better way to do this, to structure projects. Someone might even have a better framework than mine, or a better structure. I'd like to hear about it, if you have any idea. And again, if you have any questions, complaints, I don't know, you want to say hi, contact me via the comments, AppGameKit forum, my GitHub, the GitHub issues, my blog. Anyway, you can contact me. And yeah, that's it for this lesson.